In this first session, we're going to call upon thought leader Rigos Doganos yet again, doing double duty, as he often does. Just a thought, I thought the conversation that we had this morning was precisely the sort of conversation that we were all looking forward to having. Rich and probing and knowledgeable and informed. And we expect more of the same this afternoon, in the second session this morning. We're going to be taking a look specifically at global alliances and their role in the international air transport market today. But as we think about it, I mean, we had a very good conversation in the first panel about whether this industry, I hypothesized that we're still sort of in the embryonic stage of liberalization, and I believe that. I'm not sure everybody does, but I think that there's a lot more to happen. Some of the questions about why the industry isn't providing a more pleasanter, a more enjoyable experience to its customers, why it isn't treating itself as a retailer as opposed to a provider of air transport, why it isn't tapping into the economic potential of the vast customer base that it has in a more effective way. These are the questions I think that we need to keep in the forefront of our minds as we continue to talk about alternative futures for this industry. That's what's so exciting about this conference, particularly, again, because of the quality of the people that are participating in it. So, Rigos, I'm not going to take any more of your time. Please come up and lead our second panel. Thanks.
Thank you. Good morning again, ladies and gentlemen. I'm going to be a little controversial because, Jeff, I see a contradiction in two things you've said this morning. You started in the first session by saying governments are beginning to re-regulate the passenger experience. You mentioned the tarmac rule in the United States, the regulations in Europe on passenger rights, and yet you've just said 2 minutes ago that the industry should look to satisfying consumer needs. And there's a contradiction there. If we're out to satisfy consumer needs, surely we shouldn't object to regulations which are about improving the service for the consumer. But that's a subject for later on. Our issue this morning, the second panel, is talking about alliances and mega mergers, and the questions and issues that arise. And to provide a link with this morning, I'd just like to show you five or six slides. My first slide is that we talk about mega mergers as being a solution, but actually mega mergers very often create problems for the airlines involved. The revenue benefits are usually clear to see, but the cost economies are more limited, and very often there are very substantial costs in merging airlines. And we've seen that with British Airways and Iberia, with Air France and KLM. One of the costs is how do you harmonize wage levels? How do you deal with pilot seniority? Some of your hubs existing hubs may need to be downsized or closed. And there's a question created about traffic rights and nationality rule. And it's because of that, of course, that very often, rather than mergers, we've had alliances. But going back to mergers, I see there are two types of mergers that have evolved. We have the domestic mergers, where airlines in the same country are merging, and usually what happens there is that it's a true merger. And as we've seen in the United States, and to a lesser extent in India or Italy, we focus on a single brand, single marketing system, single revenue management system, and cost savings are more effective. What's happened in Europe is the mergers have not been real mergers. We've set up joint holding companies, but we keep the separate brands, separate marketing, very often and usually separate reservation systems, separate cost structures, and the cost synergies inevitably are much more limited. And this was done, of course, as I mentioned earlier, to bypass the nationality rule. The problem is, in Europe, and it may happen elsewhere as well, is that by keeping these European legacy carriers separate, they are much less effective in competing with the low-cost carriers like EasyJet and Ryanair that have bases throughout Europe, that have a pan-European brand recognition. So I think that has worked to the disbenefit, the way the mergers has worked to disbenefit to the European legacy carriers. Let's now talk about alliances and the global alliances. I see that there are effectively three phases in the development of alliances. Phase one really focuses on revenue generation. It is a phase where alliances can be broken up or members can leave or not leave. Phase two is on cost reduction. And you start with the easy bits of cost reduction, which is common ground handling, perhaps joint maintenance, joint call centers, some attempt to fleet harmonize. And phase three is really where we get to joint venture oriented kind of alliance, some of the ones we were talking about before the coffee break, where you may have a metal neutral joint venture alliance with antitrust immunity. But the problem, of course, with the mega alliances is that the alliance partners, first of all, none of the mega alliances have moved to phase three. Most of them are somewhere between phase one and phase two. But within those alliances, individual partners may have moved to phase three. And this, I think, is a destabilizing factor within those alliances. I'd like to finish by a quotation from Michael Porter, which I think is very relevant to this discussion. He said 20 years ago that alliances are a tool for extending or reinforcing competitive advantage, but rarely a sustainable means of creating competitive advantage. And I think that provides us with food for thought about what is happening in the airline industry, whether we're talking about alliances or mergers, that they may not in themselves create competitive advantage unless some competitive advantage is there already. So, that is a small introduction to the whole issue of alliances. I could have gone on speaking for an hour and a half on alliances and mergers, but I'd like to call our four panelists onto the panel for this next session, please. We have Dietmar. Can we have the names up, the panel names up, please? Well, please come up. Don't wait for me to call your names because it'll... Dietmar, why don't you start at that end? Dietmar, ex-Lufthansa, Samer Majali, ex... I call this the Jordanian panel. Please sit down, because we have one current and one former CEO of Royal Jordanian. So it is the Jordanian panel, and very pleased also to welcome Dave Bargett from JetBlue. So there are the names. A change in the program because Dietmar Kirchner has come in at the last moment. Thank you for doing that in place of the CEO of Ethiopian Airlines. So can we now go back to the questions? You've seen the names. Samer Majali is second from the right, Dave Barger third from the right, and Hussein Dabas, current chief executive of Royal Jordanian. The first question I want to put to you is big beautiful? We've had this concept in the airline industry that the bigger you get, the more successful you are, that there are economies of scale. Dietmar, as you've been involved with Lufthansa and previously with Condor, Lufthansa is the big player in Europe. Is big beautiful?
Depends, like lawyers might say. Big is not beautiful when it comes to cost, because normally size comes along with complexity, long range, short range, different types of airplanes, different types of products. All these are involved with cost. So I think on production cost, a single type airline flying out of one location with maybe 15 airplanes of the same type cannot be beaten on the cost side.
What about 200 airplanes of the same type?
Well, ask Southwest Airlines.
400 airplanes of the same
Okay, but once you start flying from a second location, you have crews flying out of the hotel, which adds cost. You have maintenance bases at various places. So Southwest is really working hard to maintain the charm of a small airline, bringing it to a large size airline. You have to think as if you were a small airline, have to have pretty separate operations, but one type of airplane helps a lot to keep costs down. Limiting yourself on anything like other services helps you to get costs down. I was also manager of Condor, and with our very small fleet, we constantly could beat Lufthansa on the seat mile cost basis. Size matters a lot when it comes to sales. Certainly a large network can be sold much easier than a small network. So for distribution, for sales, size is good. For cost, size is bad. Look at all the cost analysis that you get again and again. Normally there is no decretion on cost with the size of an airline.
So, but what's the balance? I mean, don't leave us hanging without a conclusion. You say costs go up, but you get revenue benefits, but what is the ultimate balance? Is it worth doing? Is it worth going for size?
This depends on the quality of management in any individual case. Well, there must be some room for management to perform in that situation. Some get along with that dilemma, others don't. And we see in many industries, mergers tend to fail more often than marriages, but still mergers are undertaken, but 70% of them fail. And in our industry, we have a long track record of failed mergers. So obviously, economy of scale is not something that we can observe in the industry.
But of course, there are two ways you can get scale. You can get scale by growing very rapidly, which is what JetBlue has done, or you can get scale by merging. So Dave, what's your answer? Is Big Beautiful or not?
Regis, thank you, by the way, and Peter, thank you for the invitation to be here in Istanbul. It can be, but so can smaller be beautiful as well. And so from our perspective, and you're right, JetBlue, we learned what it's like to grow too fast.
Tell us how many aircraft you have.
So we're 172 aircraft right now, and we'll close the year with 180 aircraft. And but the early chapters of a compounded annual growth rate, that's fine because you have to lay out the geography. But then at some point, as you move to free cash flow and return on invested capital metrics, it's pretty important. Otherwise, you're certainly not going to have the confidence of investors long term. So I think that big can be beautiful, but from our perspective, it's smaller. We're 5% of the ASMs in the United States, and I think that our approach is a little bit different in that smaller as you're building on a brand. And John, thank you for the comments from Via Australia, building on a brand and who your customers are and who you want to partner with in geography. I think smaller and being nimble, there's a lot to be said for that, Regis. And I think in our first decade, we've been able to seize on some of those opportunities, but not without some of the challenges of growing a company as well. So we'll see long term.
Well, let's hear from two smaller airlines. Royal Jordanian, you probably think you're not small, but tell us your fleet size and how important it is for you to get benefits of scale.
Presently, we have 30 airplanes, and I think in comparison to many of our neighbors, we are a very small airline in comparison. But I think if we want to look at airlines, big airlines, is it beautiful or not, let's look at it from a customer point of view. And a customer really doesn't care if the airline has 180 airplanes or 30 airplanes. They care about the service levels they receive and feeling appreciated for buying a ticket on that airline. So it is quite important. And as our colleague said, it's a matter of cost. And is big airline making profit, or is big airline losing money and a small airline making more money on that? As Royal Jordanian, I think we know our limitation, and our 7-year plan says that in 2017 we will only have 40 airplanes. So our plans is not to really double in size and become a big airline, because we know our capabilities and our market size and our market share that we can acquire. I really believe big is beautiful. It depends in the eyes of the beholder, as they say. I think it's very important to see what profits you're making from being big or what profits you're making from being small, because at the end of the day, it's the shareholders who really are evaluating your size, and the customers who would like to receive somewhat of a personal service when they're flying on the airline.
Samir, tell us how big your fleet is, Gulf Air.
What is this, a competition between bigger and small?
No. I want the audience to know how big or small, where you are in the spectrum.
No, we're a 40 aeroplane fleet. But just, in all these conferences, we are always looking for answers. Is there a blueprint? Is there a way of doing things? And your question is big, beautiful. Well, it is beautiful in certain cases, and it's not beautiful in others. You could be a small airline exploiting a niche market, and that particular size is ideal for that particular niche. And definitely big is not beautiful. Whereas if you are competing with a lot of carriers in a very large market, then size probably is relevant and is important. And as has been mentioned before, certain aspects of the organization or certain functions work at being bigger and certain functions do not. In terms of aircraft fleet size, generally in the industry it's considered that 15 to 20 airplanes achieve the economies of scale that you want, and going beyond that, there are no economies of scale. Emirates, for example, has 330s and 777s, airplanes which are commercially very similar in terms of size and capabilities and function. They're slightly different in terms of range, but they have both fleets because they have 40 and 50 and 60 airplanes. So in the end, there is no one answer. Size and it depends on the particular circumstances, on the particular airline in question, and so on. There's no general rule that says this is better or this is worse.
That is absolutely true. On the other hand, we see the trend in the industry is going towards larger size. And we see that through mergers, through acquisitions, and through alliances. So the question still remains, is that the right way for the industry to be going? We have, and I'm going to ask Dietmar about this, we have Lufthansa buying smaller sized airlines in Europe. When Swiss did that 10, 15 years ago, the so-called Hunter strategy, it destroyed the airline. So Dietmar, having been close to Lufthansa, what is the logic of buying these smaller airlines, virtually all of them except Swiss, losing money? Is it a marketing issue? Is it a size issue?
Well, it's a mixture of offensive and defensive thinking behind that. Offensive, yes, I can grow my market in a nice way. And defensive, I do it before somebody else buys some airline in my backyard. And I think that both reasons very often come into play. Mergers work nicely, sometimes like the Lufthansa-Swiss merger, which was very nicely done and orchestrated, and it helped both airlines a lot. And as you see with BMI, it cannot work, although they are pretty much the same people playing at least at one end. So there is nothing you can really predict about that. You showed on your chart that multinational mergers sometimes do not really return the savings that you might have with a domestic merger. However, you missed one very successful model, that of LAN Chile in South America, or of Asia in Asia, where you have a single brand multi-operator strategy. And this one obviously seems to be a model that we should be looking into for the future, because it has the governance you will not find in an alliance, and you will never get to step 2 or 3 in an alliance without some common governance. And this will be lacking as long as they are not able to set up a joint holding company that runs the whole thing. And this is what we have in LAN, and this is what we have in Asia, this is what we have in Arabia. So I think this model seems to be more viable than the alliance model, which was great in phase 1.
I raised it, of course, in the first session when I said this was one way of bypassing the ownership regulations.
But LAN and Air Arabia and Air Asia are bypassing the ownership regulations as well.
Well, that's what I'm saying. That was a way of bypassing them, that forced them into that model. Yeah. And you're saying it's working well.
And it seems to be working better from a governance, from a brand, and from a cost point of view than the alliances are doing.
Okay, let's move on to the second question, which is whether joining a global alliance actually produces the benefits that one has expected. Royal Jordanian, I think, has been a member of the One World Alliance, for 3 years now.
Correct.
Tell us what the benefits are. Are they real? Are there any costs involved?
Actually, for Royal Jordanian, joining a world alliance like One World was a great advantage for Royal Jordanian, simply because we're small and we would never be able to use our metal to access the markets that we are doing through the alliance. And this is a major factor of why we wanted and opted to join the alliance. Samer was the CEO of RJ at that time, and we were working together to get this alliance accomplished. With the alliance, we were able to access a huge number of markets and city pairs that we would never be able to do it on our own. However, if we look right now on what agreements we have with the members of One World Alliance, we're probably dealing closely more with 3 or 4 of the 12, 13 members, and others, other than meeting with each other, this is the maximum cooperation we have. But it had also, for an airline like RJ, expanded our horizon tremendously. It had improved our IT solutions, it improved our service levels. We had to upgrade a lot of our programs to match the requirements of the One World Alliance. And I think this was a great advantage for an airline of the size of Royal Jordanian and with the strategic plan of the airline. I really believe that as RJ, we benefited tremendously from the alliance, and we can see the numbers have increased a lot in terms of revenue and exchange of passengers between some of the alliance members and RJ. And the most important is that you now see Royal Jordanian in Santiago, Chile, and in Osaka, Japan, and in Melbourne, Australia, which we would never have been there had it been as an airline on our own.
So you're saying effectively that for a small carrier like Royal Jordanian, I hate to use the word small because some didn't like the suggestion, but anyway, of limited size, let's put it that way, that there are significant benefits because of the huge expansion you get into your marketplace. Dave, JetBlue is an enigma in a way because you have a Lufthansa shareholding and you seem to have focused on a lot of bilateral alliances. Would you like to talk about how you see that model working and what the benefits for you are?
Sure, Regis. It's well, first of all, Lufthansa, it's interesting, right, as we talk about foreign investment. And when they invested in JetBlue, it was 19%, today 16%. And recently, a couple of weeks ago, Lufthansa actually monetized that investment with a global exchange bond, right, sold in a euro-denominated a global exchange bond. So it's been rather interesting to see what's happened with Lufthansa ownership in JetBlue, which, by the way, when it happened in 2008, very, very beneficial for our company. As oil was doing this, as the economy was on its heels, and the global expertise, we have 2 board members of 11 seats with Lufthansa, and they've been very, very helpful to our company. All that said, when we look at our open architecture model, and based at Kennedy Airport, the largest airport in New York, as you know, we're the largest airline at JFK, and we operate about 30% of the ASMs, from a domestic perspective, in and out of, or I should say employments, in and out of Kennedy Airport. And this open architecture model, we don't really use the word alliance, partnership, we think is the path forward for us. And we're now at 16 different companies. And we're exchanging customers across Kennedy and Boston and places like Orlando and LAX. And we think that type of architecture, as opposed to moving into a Star Alliance or moving into SkyTeam or One World, right now is a better approach for us. And that's not to say that in the future that may not change. You want optionality, but we really don't see the benefits of adding complexity, the cost of joining an alliance, when we see, and maybe even where you can't, in fact, put in place the bilateral partnerships because of some of the how some of the language is in place with the bylaws across the alliances. And so we think open architecture is the right way to go for us. And as we look even in the United States with the is bigger better, that same idea, the large carriers, how much benefit has taken place for The largest airline in the world, I guess now today, is United. I started at New York Air, thanks Mike, and then at Continental and into JetBlue today. And you look at United, bankruptcy, Continental, bankruptcy, and you look at Delta, now the second largest airline in the world, bankruptcy, Northwest, bankruptcy, and now American going through bankruptcy, US Airways in a couple of bankruptcies, all these alliance carriers. I just wonder how much benefit there's been. And
well, this is why I posed the question, because precisely because of those examples.
You're exactly right. This is closer to home, obviously. There's not a lot of North American representation here in Istanbul, and maybe that's for good reason, right? Because of some of the challenges that I think the mega carriers have seen. So question mark in terms of that being a model of success, Regis, and this is where we think open architecture is the right path for JetBlue, and I think other carriers as well. Via Australia was talking about that, Alaska, JetBlue, and others around the world.
Well, let me ask you a specific question, because as a non-executive board member of EasyJet, it interests me. Do you think your model is a model that Ryanair or EasyJet should follow? In other words, the open architecture, a very specific example. EasyJet is the largest carrier at Gatwick Airport. Mm-hmm. It has a huge range of destinations. Should it be making an alliance with a long-haul carrier coming into Gatwick to service Europe?
It's an interesting, because we'll spend some time with Carolyn and the EasyJet team on this trip, right, to just thought partner on different models. And so I look forward to heading to Luton before heading home. And I think it's a possibly. And why I say that is Kennedy and Gatwick obviously has the tremendous amount of similarities, but JFK, there's 75 airlines operating in and out of Kennedy Airport. And it really was an O&D market. It was somewhat of a dead end. There was no connecting traffic opportunities. I think that's why Pan Am bought National Airlines. When you look back in history, didn't work. TWA didn't work. Longer term, I mean, after decades of flying. So for us, Kennedy, it was just a natural place to plug in, whether it was a star carrier, One World, SkyTeam, or the independent airlines. And there's an awful lot of independent airlines operating at JFK. So EasyJet, I think possibly at a place like Gatwick, but obviously not at many of the other locations because of the size or the lack of international connectivity opportunities. So possibly, Regis, I'm not giving a declaration, because you obviously know better than we.
Well, you can discuss it with Carolyn, our CEO, later in the week. Samir, what is the position of Gulf Air on alliances, bilateral
or otherwise?
Or otherwise, or global alliances?
Yeah, I mean, again, potentially similar to what happened with Royal Jordanian. The Gulf Air suffers obviously from quite stiff competition in the immediate region within 100 miles of each other, some of the fastest growing airlines in the world and some of the most well-supported ones. Gulf Air in the past obviously was owned by all of these states, and there was no competition in place there. And Gulf Air has had to adjust over the last 15 years in terms of finding its new role in this very, very competitive and very difficult environment. The states themselves withdrawing their ownership and also setting up very large airlines in place that are giving Lufthansa a headache, not just Gulf Air. And our strategy at the time was to build a very strong regional network, so that and deviating slightly from the other three carriers that are in the region there.
So run down the long haul, I think.
A little bit, yeah. Concentrate less on the long haul to long haul connections and look more at the regional short haul to short haul connections, especially into the difficult regions like Iraq, Iran, and Pakistan and places like that, where the yields are higher and the costs are lower. And build something in place that is slightly different from what the other guys are doing. And we had some success with that in 2010, but unfortunately the situation fell apart in 2011.
Why did it fall apart? Because of the high fuel?
High fuel, but also the Arab Spring and the Arab Spring generally in the Arab world, and specifically also the issues in Bahrain itself. And therefore, our strategy was actually geared directly with having a very strong regional network in terms of allowing us to be, or hopefully be, very attractive to an alliance in terms of offering our network as value added to these alliances that don't have the network connectivity within the region itself. And so that our strategy was directly linked with trying to find alliance partners and to demonstrate that some of the Gulf carriers may be potentially good alliance partners rather than the exact opposite. And we're still looking into this, and this is basically the way ahead for Gulf Air in the future, where we offer, within a 3-hour radius of the Gulf, connectivity into every primary and secondary point with a high-frequency service. And this market is as yet untapped, and link up with the global carriers through alliances.
So you're really doing what I suggested in the first session, is really rethinking your whole strategy,
Absolutely.
Your whole model. Let me move on to my next question, which is whether airlines should be focusing on alliances rather than mergers. Dietmar, I wonder if you can talk on that. I mean, we've heard so far from JetBlue and from Royal Jordanian the significant benefits of alliances. If that's the case, should one be following a merger strategy as well, which is what Lufthansa has been doing?
Well,
and Air France and British Airways.
Well, all three found out that there is a ceiling with regard to cooperating in an alliance due to the lack of governance. You cannot tell the other guys what the brand should be like, what the class configuration should be like. There might be some coordination on the network, but there's hardly any benefit on the cost side. Mergers get you a little bit further into that route. Lufthansa also tried to set up a known operation in Italy, which was doing it a different way. It failed because Italy was capable of pretty much keeping Lufthansa out of Linate Airport, which is important for the traffic.
Well, it wasn't Italy that did that, it was EasyJet that did it.
Well, obviously they had smarter agent in Italy. Anyway.
Better product, better service, and more aircraft.
Yeah.
I think we have to give EasyJet some credit for pushing Lufthansa out of Milan and not put it to the Italians.
As I said in the previous comment, I think alliances don't get you very far. Mergers have the problems that you described in your initial presentation. I think we have to look at something different, either a franchise system or a system along the lines of, as I said, LAN Chile or Asia or Arabia, something like that. Or maybe we will see people from outside orchestrating the industry, because when we talk about connectivity, don't forget that in the future connectivity will be managed by Google and Apple and their mobile devices they have in the pocket of every person. So they will take care that you get on your connecting flight, and they will take care that you have a boarding pass in your pocket. So don't rely too much on your internal connectivity. I think that very soon people like Google, Apple, Facebook, Amazon, I'm always taking those four, they will be orchestrating your travel much better than any airlines would be, or alliance would be able to do.
Thank you. Dave, I think you seem to be a firmer believer in the notion that alliances are better than mergers.
Alliances are easier to establish. They take you to step 1 and 1.5 according to your presentation, and they save you the headaches of integrating pilot seniority schemes, which is the worst headache that you can imagine in this industry, and they get you to 80% of what you can achieve with a merger, but the merger achieves only a percentage of what you could achieve with another system.
Let's ask David, because he's seen the environment in the United States, though you haven't been involved in a merger directly as JetBlue, you've seen what others have done.
Sure.
Does it make sense to merge at all?
At a headline, for us, absolutely not. I mean, from a merger perspective, and today, from an alliance perspective, we're not interested in either one. And it's partnerships where we can exchange traffic, but keep it simple without entering the mega alliance world. That makes sense to us. And I won't go into a long history lesson, but The first customer in the United States purchased a ticket flying from St. Petersburg to Tampa, Florida in 1914. And we're now close to a century later. And when you aggregate profits and losses over those 100 years, the industry has not been profitable in the United States. And so when you look at doing things a different way, a contrarian way, boy, I tell you, that's the way that we're looking at it. And this organic growth, the right partnerships, it may surprise some of you to learn that our 14,000 crew members, our word for employees, are union free. And we're attempting to do things differently. And if all of a sudden you start to get into, Dietmar, you were just talking about how tough it is to integrate pilot seniority lists. Who's flying? Is it scope clauses? I mean, this is the kind of stuff that you just, it chokes you from really trying to be creative and innovative and pushing your brand forward. So I think right now, Regis, it's absolutely not from a merger perspective. We're a public company, so we have to take the call if somebody is interested. And really right now, from a global alliance perspective, it's just not something that we're interested in either as we sit here in 2012.
Samir or Hussein, do you want to comment on mergers or alliances?
I think, Samir,
Yeah, go ahead.
mergers work very well in economies like the US or the EU. But in other parts of the world, airlines are a very nationalistic brand. And it's extremely difficult to have that brand disintegrate or removed. And that's why I believe, at least in a big part of the world, mergers will be more of a financial investment rather than taking over like Delta and Northwest or Continental and United. I believe, for example, in Royal Jordanian, we are looking at some kind of a strategic alliance where there is an exchange of capital, an exchange of ownership, according to the ownership laws that exist right now of 49% or so on. I think it's valuable for airlines like RJ to be in partnership with another airline, establish 2 or 3 hubs in the region and consolidate your resources, increase your buying power of other services and so on. But to move away from a brand becomes very difficult. I believe in many parts of the world, after independence, the first thing that governments do is establish an airline because it is an engine of growth. It is a pillar in the growth of any economy. And let's not kid ourselves. Malev disappeared because it's part of the EU, and another airline can jump in immediately into Budapest and establish a hub there. But had it been, let's say, God forbid, Royal Jordanian disappears, it's going to take a very long time to establish another airline, and it will be a big hit and blow to the economy, to the traveling public, and to any kind of economic activity in that part of the world.
I think you've brought us down to earth in the same way as the Director General of Civil Aviation of Lebanon did in the first session, by telling us that there is a direct, strong political dynamic to the ownership and operation of airlines in the developing world and even in the developed world in some parts of Asia and South America. Samir, do you want to comment?
For sure. I mean, Europe, actually, surprisingly enough, KLM has not disappeared yet. And it doesn't look like disappearing yet. So that particular merger is still a merger of 2 brands, and the brands are being kept alive, even though theoretically speaking, this is a fully commercial merger with no political, at least long-term political constraints. I don't know when the Northwest Delta issue will become one airline, or will they just combine the 2 names together or something like that. So, but it's true. The cases for mergers and the mechanics of the mergers are also very important. Not only, and we're going back to this issue of is big beautiful, not only is the final product going to be beautiful, but getting there and the risks of getting there and how to get there kills a lot of the particular mergers that have been attempted. The difficulties have been underestimated, and again, there's no blueprint for the risks. In the US, it's pilot contracts, and merging seniority, and in Europe as well. In other parts of the world, that is a non-issue. Other issues are the important ones, like Hassan mentioned, the different political reasons behind setting up the national carriers. So the different challenges in every particular case not only, significantly affect not only the net result, but also the risks associated with getting there, and whether this will be successful or not in the end.
Interestingly, you mentioned KLM Air France. If one reads carefully the press statements and the analysts' report on Air France KLM, KLM is doing well, and Air France is actually the one that's in difficulties. And I mentioned earlier that they're losing fistfuls of dollars or euros on their European operations. A question which I think is relevant to this session and to the session this afternoon is whether low-cost carriers should join global alliances. And I suppose, David, you're closest to facing this question. Would there be any benefit at all in you, joining presumably the Star Alliance because you have a Lufthansa shareholding? Is there potentially any benefit to you for doing that?
Well, as we currently look at the landscape, not necessarily so. And but again, I think optionality is how we want to look at the future, because what's in place today is going to be different 10 years from now. We know that. Is there going to be 3 alliances? Is there going to be 4? Is there going to be 2? We'll see what happens into the future. But I think really at the end of the day, if we were to, just our geography at Kennedy Airport, Regis, if we were, and Star is not the largest player at JFK, and that's over 50% of our ASMs. So for us to plug into that just de facto because of the ownership stake of Lufthansa, it just didn't make sense. And oneworld is a larger player there. SkyTeam is the largest player there. And so just to, because of the ownership stake, make a decision for us, it was pretty academic. It didn't make sense. And as I think about the opportunity to partner with all 3 of the alliance carriers, which we're doing today, whether it's Korean coming in from Seoul, or whether it's Lufthansa coming in from obviously Europe, or whether it's even partnering now with American Airlines, the opportunity is Christoph Mueller, who's here with Aer Lingus, and that connectivity, the Emirates aircraft that operate into Kennedy every day. The benefit is significant for us. And still, at the end of the day, we talk about alliances and partnerships. For us, this is still a small part of our business. To the earlier comment, 86% of our traffic is point-to-point. And the 14% that is connecting, by and large, it's across the JetBlue system. It's not to the international footprint, not yet. So it's growing. We just want optionality. So that's our point of view.
Let me ask you a specific question. As a result of your bilateral alliances, do you find your yields are higher for those passengers that are connecting passengers than your local point-to-point traffic would be?
Not necessarily. I can't give you a yes or no, and here's the reason for it. First of all, if you think about the old interlining, that's in essence what we're doing. We're pretty much interlining, however, it's some sectors. So we don't have to get into the square roots and prorates and mileage and short haul and long haul, which keeps it simple. So when somebody is purchasing a ticket from Dublin to New Orleans 30 days out, we get the benefit of whatever the local customer would have been purchasing that same ticket, but they're obviously doing it through the Aer Lingus website benefit. But then what happens is over time, the local customer, by the time he or she is booking, maybe the fare buckets have been closed because of the Aer Lingus bookings, because of the South African bookings, because of. So I like to think that it's 2 + 2 = 6.
Dietmar, should low-cost carriers join one of the global alliances?
Well, Dave gave the answer. I think they're better off in exploiting their local power, whatever their local power is in their geography. But just imagine another thing, that the low-cost carriers with this regional footprint they're having, they sit together and decide that they should have a system connecting those regional systems with a long-range carrier that they jointly set up, and then they would be the 4th alliance, and that would be a very interesting player.
I can see a sort of 2 different models. Clearly, if you are a big airline like JetBlue with 150, 170 aircraft. The impact on your overall revenue and network of alliances, bilateral alliances, can be relatively small. And you suggest that it's some part of 14%. Right. But for a relatively small carrier, like the Gulf and Royal Jordanian, does it become much more, do these alliances, bilateral or global, become much more critical in terms of the amount of revenue they can generate for you?
As far as this is back to the low-cost carrier business. I think the low-cost carrier introduces an additional complication into the alliance issue in terms of the product. How do you reconcile the product? There's an implied product offering in any alliance partnership in terms of the quality of your economy service across the networks and the type and quality of your product offering across the business class and so on. And with the low-cost carrier, you have a product differential, and therefore you can't offer business class across the offering, and you can't even potentially on some of the economy products. And so I think it's just a further complication, and I agree that the low-cost carriers, and generally the big ones or the successful ones, have little interest in joining an alliance on a multilateral basis, but definitely on a partnership basis it makes a lot of sense. So they look at the individual traffic flows and the individual products and see if that can be, rather than go for the whole.
I think that's very valuable, but I'd like to disagree with you on something you said at the beginning, that if the global alliances try to standardize their products. I think one of the failures of the global alliances is that they have been unable to do that. And let me give you an example. In the United Kingdom, there's a consumers association that carries out every 2 years a survey of members who have traveled long haul and short haul, but long haul, over the last 12 months for leisure and for business. But I'll just quote you the leisure thing. 30,000 people responded, so it's a big sample, and they were asked, amongst other questions, would you recommend this airline, highly recommend this airline to your friends? Star Alliance members, Singapore Airlines, Air New Zealand were getting 80-85% approval. US Air and United were getting 35 to 40% approval. And that is because there are significant product differences. I think it's a myth to imagine that flying economy in United is the same as flying economy or business class parallel with Singapore Airlines or Thai or Air New Zealand.
I didn't say they do it well.
No.
I just said there's an implied.
There is an implied, but I don't think it's there. Let's throw. One of the questions is about antitrust immunity, but I think we need. I should have asked that with John Borghetti when he was here, what the benefits are and how critical it is for alliances. I don't know whether any of you want to comment. I don't think any of you are involved in antitrust. So.
We are actually.
Oh, you are. Go on, Hussein.
We are involved in antitrust immunity, and we have filed together with American BA and Iberia on the cross-Atlantic. I think having antitrust immunity is extremely important if you really want to align your schedule, your many issues in terms of course, not the pricing word, but other issues that governments do put restrictions on how much you can cooperate. I think alliances, and in order to be able to complement your schedule, you need, and it's a must, to get the antitrust immunity. Otherwise, you will be playing in different fields and not in the same field to maximize the benefits of an alliance. And it is important, and I think governments are realizing that you need to allow some leverage to the airlines to be able to talk to each other, at least on a commercial part, without discussing pricing or price fixing and all the taboos, of course, that we have in our industry. It is a must. It is something that most airlines, when they or alliances, need to pursue this avenue.
Okay, I think that's a very strong argument. Dietmar, do you have any comments on this antitrust immunity?
Well, alliances are always challenging the rules of antitrust regulators, and which is normal because they are orchestrating competition one way or the other, and this is something that is always under scrutiny of the antitrust authorities, and right they are in that respect, and most of the benefits in the alliances come from some sort of an orchestrated offering to the market, let's put it that way.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, the floor is yours. You've got 4 experts on the floor. I think it looks like Mike Levine, but the sun is behind you, and I can only see you in silhouette. So.
It is Mike Levine of NYU, and my question is for Detlef or anyone else who wants to comment. But I want to ask him about his logic about alliances put together with what I thought was his very good and astute analysis of the difference between the cost and the revenue side impact of mergers. If it's true that mergers give you sales advantages, marketing advantages, but give you production disadvantages, why isn't a stage 3 alliance, which you seem to dismiss almost out of hand, which separates the factory from the marketing department, that is, you get a joint marketing department and separate factories, a rather logical way to go? I was one of the architects of the first stage 3 alliances, which was KLM Northwest, and that's exactly what we did. And for us, for what it's worth, it moved our North Atlantic market share from, joint market share from 7% to 12%.
Dietmar, do you want?
Well, I do not see that alliances are really one restaurant with 10 different kitchens. They have 10 different restaurants, and they have a bonus program that works in all 10 different restaurants. So there is not that common brand that you might have in a Hyatt hotel chain or in the Avis rental car system. Because we just heard what we see in the United Kingdom, that the brand perception isn't there. There is an enormous amount of internal competition on many routes still left. Just go to whatever online travel site and take Warsaw to Chicago. Well, there is a lot flying, and you will see a different offering from any Star Alliance carrier, let alone the other alliances. But even within the alliances, you will always find very diverging fares depending on the day of week and whatever. So alliances are not able, through their governance, to establish a multinational, multi-airline dominance of one idea, one approach to the market. This is not Hyatt, this is not Avis.
Let's take, speaking to the mic, please.
We had a single yield management system, a committee that jointly coordinated what we did.
Well, you had...
And for us, at least, if you went online, you got the same quotations wherever you went. We coordinated common elements only in the business class, and only a few of them, to make sure the seat expectation was reasonable and so on. And our customers didn't seem to demand more commonality than that.
Well, it worked because there were 2 airlines in a very limited market. But I hear that Star Alliance is trying for many years now to establish something similar on the North Atlantic with a multitude of carriers. And the common IT system, a system in Star that is called Common IT System, is used just by one carrier. So you see that obviously theory and practice are pretty much apart. And there's a reason for that.
Do you want to comment on this question of the degree to which you should... essentially the question is about the degree to which you can integrate the selling functions and leave the operations separate. I think that was the essence of your question. When you have mergers or alliances.
Well, Mike, by the way, when I look back to Northwest KLM, it was, and Detroit's my home, right? So I saw some huge benefits of that partnership, right? And I mean, it was intense. I mean, across Detroit, Minneapolis, New York, and also the synergies between the two. I do think, again, we don't play in the merger space, and we don't play in the full alliance space as we're using it here, this partnership terminology. But I do think that from the standpoint of harvesting, certainly we're talking about the revenue synergies, but also the opportunity to harvest some of the cost synergies. We're attempting to do that. And whether that's ground handling, or whether that's how we're processing a customer, whether the customer, how they're booking, whether it's through our website or somebody else's. I mean, we're young at it compared to many who are in the room or across the globe. But certainly the revenue side, we think that a lot of it, interestingly enough, Regis, is what's the spirit of the company that you're dealing with? And it's what we have found is that, and we now partner with 16 airlines, there are some that are just culturally so easy to just partner with, even though we live in different parts of the world. And there are others that are so bureaucratic, even though we're doing some partnership, there's others who we just don't even want to partner with because it's too hard. It's just too hard. They're too set in their way. And the leader can talk a really good story, but it just dies in the organization because this is how we do business. And as opposed to, let's get innovative and think about a better way to do business. So I do think there's opportunities to harvest above the line as well as below the line. I really do.
I think the partners issues is critical. I was on the board of South African Airways when we were trying to choose between joining SkyTeam and Star, and we found dealing with the French team in SkyTeam was impossible.
Surprise.
Don't quote me on that, There's a question here.
Just going to the earlier session.
Say who you are, and perhaps stand up. And then
Thanks,
people...
This is Emre from Intervistas. So just going to the earlier session, we heard that the network carriers, they are simplifying the product on the short haul. And then we have very successful examples like Vueling offering advanced services at low cost. So given that the product differential is decreasing, and given that we've heard examples with, for instance, Virgin Australia and Etihad, you have JetBlue and Lufthansa, don't we see this as a developing trend? For instance, a question to you, are we going to see EasyJet and Virgin Atlantic combining their operations or code sharing or finding synergies like EasyJet feeding Virgin Atlantic in the long term?
Well, I don't think we would. I can't speak for EasyJet, but I would hesitate
not, why not?
to merge with an airline that's not profitable to start with. But anyway, I think the reality is, and I showed a slide this morning, that there are intense and growing linkages between the low-cost carriers and the legacy carriers. And I think Dave's examples from JetBlue, most of your partners are network legacy carriers rather than other low-cost carriers.
That's correct. I think they're all network carriers. And I think the only one that's a little bit different might be Hawaiian, right, which is certainly not a low-cost carrier, but not a network carrier itself. And I think the opportunity to plug in from a product perspective, I mean, we don't have a business cabin, as was mentioned, for example, but I think what's been found, and by the way, we're in this LCC category, but we really think that we're a value proposition. We're not the lowest cost provider. We're not a Spirit in North America. We're not a Southwest in terms of the cost structure, but just above it. And AirTran is now gone, right, part of the Southwest system, but this value proposition, where at the end of the day, I think people are paying us a premium, and we're seeing that, this commodity business. So we plug quite nicely when somebody comes in from Johannesburg, connecting down to Orlando or Washington or wherever the case might be, even though they're coming out of a business cabin. It seems to work quite well.
Hussein, you want to comment on that?
Actually, I mean, if we look back at the LCC business plan that was done several years ago, there was nothing in it that said that you can travel between Minneapolis to Atlanta via Philadelphia. It's either point-to-point or no LCC. But in the past several years, we've seen this model change, and no longer LCCs just operate point-to-point, but at least in our part of the world, we see them becoming a legacy carrier in some way by having a transfer. So in many cases, they become a low-fare carrier rather than a low-cost carrier. And I believe now alliances are looking very seriously at the LCCs because they are able to attract a different kind of passenger and a far wider network than they will ever be able to do. And if we look at the product proposition, as Samer was saying. The LCCs are flying 2 to 3 hours, and if we look at the European carriers now flying between 2 or 3 hours, you pay for your water and your Pepsi and your peanuts and so on. So there's not much difference between BA flying between London and Cologne and EasyJet doing the same, because you do have to buy your product, you do have a limited seat pitch and so on. So I believe alliances are looking seriously at LCCs, and if I can speak on behalf of Oneworld, which we are a member of, that's why we started talking to Air Berlin, which was initially, and to a large part is a low-cost carrier, but now have joined the alliance, and they have on the long haul two-class service, but on the medium haul or short haul, it is a one-class service. And the same, I think, will be spoken later on about WestJet in Canada or other airlines in the region, like in Australia, Jetstar, and so on, where they can become affiliate members, maybe not necessarily full members, but affiliate members to the alliance to help feed the traffic that maybe the full-fledged carriers are unable to access.
But the corollary of that is that the legacy carriers will shrink their short-haul operations.
That is a possibility, yes.
And those legacy carriers that have only short-haul operations
will have a problem.
Are an engendered species.
Yes.
Endangered species. Okay, we agree on that. Any more questions from the floor? It's your unique opportunity. Yes, there's a question here.
Yeah, hi, my name is Jay Shalat. I'm from Jet Airways. Real quick question for the panel. Does the 787 play any equation in the alliance role? And what I mean by that, when you have United looking at Houston, Auckland, when you have Japan Airlines, who's a co-chair partner with JetBlue, looking at Narita, Boston, I think the 787 should play a significant role in the alliance. Or does the panel think that?
Does new technology, which is really what you're talking about, an enhanced range, alter the dynamics of the alliances or the potential alliances? David, would you like to comment?
Sure. It's Jay. I think, I happen to believe that Japan Airlines, flying first ever from Asia to Boston, we're the largest carrier at Boston, and we're now over 100 today and growing our operation. That network behind that arrival of the 787, their launch route, I mean, that was a perfect example of what this airplane is going to be able to do in terms of these. It used to be called niche routes, but my gosh, I mean, that's a big market between Japan, the connecting complex behind it, and Boston, just the local market, let alone you add the connecting traffic behind it. So that's one example. That's their first route of the 787. And other partners that we're talking to, they're saying the use of that airplane, long and thin, into places like JFK, into places like Boston, into places like San Juan, real interesting opportunities for us. So we think it's somewhat of a game changer, at least how we're looking at it. I'm not sure what the others might be thinking, but we've been the beneficiary there in Boston.
I think it's a good thing. I mean, that particular airplane, that apart from being obviously a very economic airplane and a very passenger-friendly airplane, but also having the range characteristics and having the right size, will actually solve problems in the future, maybe problems like Gatwick, where Heathrow now currently is very congested, very expensive, inefficiently run, from at least a lot of airlines' point of view, but obviously very attractive because it has all the connections. And Gatwick, which is potentially a bit more efficient and less congested and so on, but has not been well developed as a hub airport, as a second hub airport for London and a network airport into the UK. So I think this particular airplane will be able to become much more feasible in developing secondary, more efficient hubs as an alternative for a passenger, rather than rerouting through the large, oversized, difficult hubs like London and other points. So I think, yes, the landscape will change with the development of these new airplanes in putting the more efficient but smaller hubs onto the global map.
Samer, since you've been talking, I wonder if I could ask you a question which has come to my mind as a result of our discussion today. You talked earlier about the challenges of having to compete with the large Gulf carriers, having to compete with low-cost Gulf carriers, Why did you transform Gulf Air into a low-cost airline?
Well,
Because you're thrashing around trying to find a model that's somewhere in between. Why don't you just become a low-cost carrier?
well, I mean,
with your market.
You just shot my strategy down in your last statement about short-haul legacy carriers being a thing of the past. I think in different parts of the world, there's different developments. I think that's where I disagree in terms of the product offering. Still in parts of the Middle East and the Gulf, people want to travel on a 50-minute flight in a 777 with entertainment and a sleeperette seat, even though they might not use any of these features. So, there are still different attractiveness and different passenger requirements in different parts of the world, and there are different decisions in terms of what carriers that they choose. And this is why I still think that as a regional legacy carrier in our part of the world, still is a major way forward for us, and it provides us the required niche to be able to compete. So I think still our particular strategy is very, very, very much valid in our part of the world. It may not be valid elsewhere.
Okay, thank you. There's a question at the back there. Again, please say who you are.
Shashank Nigam with Simply Flying. A quick observation. There are airlines, legacy carriers, which own low-cost carriers these days. Qantas, Jetstar, Iberia, Iberia Express, Vueling. And even though the Jetstars of the world are not in the alliance, you can today earn Qantas miles on Jetstar by paying a fee. And Jetstar takes that as ancillary. Qantas Frequent Flyer Club is quite happy to award miles at that time. And then you see this model sort of possibly being replicated, let's say in Spain, when there's Iberia and Iberia Express, you can earn miles on Iberia Express and not on Vueling, which is also owned partly by Iberia. Thai has Thai Smiles coming up soon, and Nok Air, and no miles on Nok Air, miles on Thai Smiles. Where do you see this going? Is this a growing trend or a way to get low-cost carriers into the door of Alliance without really getting them in there fully?
David.
Sure, I'll jump in on that. I do think this currency of frequent flyer, right? I mean, FFP, the currency, the ability to utilize that, even though you might not be part of an alliance, if you will, but you still partner with that company. This is a great way, I mean, to really knock down actually a liability, right, of the frequent flyer program, but also ease the customer service as well. And so it's really creative in terms of what's happening when you look at Air New Zealand and the creation of literally a bank card, if you will. What's happening with Norwegian and the bank that's wrapped around the airline, but the FFP that goes with it. So I think it is a development, right? And for us, as we start to partner into different airlines, this currency, and boy, it's not easy when you start to talk about IT challenges, right? But but the ability to literally at altitude swipe and drive down, use that liability, that asset, but drive down the company's liability, I think is a wave of the future. And airlines that get there, they're going to be in a really nice competitive position.
I think the question raises another issue which we touched on in the earlier session this morning. As the questioner pointed out, we've seen most of the Asian legacy carriers setting up low-cost subsidiaries. The American carriers tried that 15, 20 years ago with Delta Light, with TED and so on, gave up. KLM, British Airways did the same and gave up. Do you think now there will be a resurgence amongst non-Asian carriers into setting up low-cost subsidiaries? We've seen it, first of all, with Iberia Express. Lufthansa is now putting great emphasis on Germanwings. Yes, Dietmar.
Well, the problem why it failed in the US was always a labor issue, that you had a spillover of your mainline cost into what was planned to be a low-cost airline, and it was not from day one. You see the problems that Iberia has with its almost monthly strikes because the unions do not like them setting up a low-cost airline. You see what happened to the Open Skies project of British Airways when they wanted to fly with a different pay scale out of France and other places in Europe to the United States. Air France is tiptoeing around the same problem. Lufthansa has problems in keeping their low-cost subsidiary Germanwings clear of Lufthansa legacy costs. They failed. So again and again, once you own a low-cost airline, you automatically have a spillover
of your mainline cost. It may be different in some parts in Asia. That's why they try it. But it's not just the spillover of your mainline labor cost, it's also a spillover of your mainline thinking. And the DNA of a low-cost airline is completely different to the DNA of a network carrier. And many people in network carriers, they have to learn low cost from scratch, and sometimes they are successfully, sometimes they are not. So setting up a low-cost subsidiary within a legacy airline is pretty hard. And it didn't work in the US, it hardly worked in Europe.
Yes, Samir.
Sorry, the main drivers seem to be in the Far East is more of a defensive strategy rather than opening up new avenues of business. I'm not sure that the mainline legacy carriers believe in low-cost carriers. I mean, all the time they talk about competing with them and how their model is so efficient and how the low-cost carrier models is not efficient. And then they go up and set up their own low-cost carriers. I think it's primarily a defensive measure. Definitely in the case of Emirates in Dubai, Fly Dubai was a defensive measure to block anybody else starting up in Dubai, and so on. And maybe also used to absorb airplanes as well, but that's another thing.
And of course that defensive measure reaches its peak with All Nippon Airways, which is setting up 2 low-cost carriers.
Well, but I think in the main it seems to be a defensive measure to block rather than a new business opportunity. And that in its own right fosters a lot of the things that has been talked about. A lot of the culture gets transferred, a lot of the costs get transferred. So this is why I'm not sure that it's a defensive measure, so maybe they're willing to take a loss on it. But it's not a great business avenue and new opportunity for the legacy carriers.
David, having the US experience, seeing the tremendous inroads that you and Southwest and Allegiant and others are making in the US network carriers, do you think they will at any point rethink the low-cost model, or are the labor issues so serious that is not an option?
I would agree with Dietmar. I think it's been tried. It didn't work. It was to try to correct really the cost bloat that took place and the work rules that set in over time. And so I think that wave is over. And with the JetBlues, Southwest, I mean, there's plenty of opportunity for customers now in the United States to have a lower fare opportunity on a point-to-point system. And there's plenty of space, I think now, that the industry is right-sizing through this consolidation phase to fly on a network carrier as well. So I don't see going back to that either as well. And this is one of the reasons why we're working so hard. We're 12 years into this, but to preserve a non-union environment. And it's the ability to collaborate instead of negotiate. I just can't tell you how nice that is to enter work every day, as opposed to where's the hidden agenda, and just not agreeing, right? And just being transparent. We heard that term earlier today. It's huge. I mean, it's really, really important.
And are you prepared to comment on the likelihood of success of so many Asian low-cost carriers linked to network airlines?
Well, it's from within our company, we're really intrigued when you look at AirAsia and AirAsia X, because it's a brand that over time is building into something else. It's not unlike Virgin Blue, which we partnered with originally with Live TV, into now Via Australia. It was growing into something that was more than point-to-point locally, as opposed to you already have the parent that's trying to correct or trying to compete or trying to be defensive. So don't get me wrong, we look at Tiger, we look at all the different propositions. We're curious about Peach and what have you, but it's who was point-to-point like we were on day one, who's now flying 330s or 350s or 777s or looking at 787s. That's intriguing to us, because what got us here, we believe, won't get us there. If we stay with this mindset, over time, JetBlue won't be here. And so that's the way that at least the management team is thinking.
I think Tiger is a good example, because we had Singapore Airlines with Tiger, with Silk Air operating short haul as SIA, now setting up a long haul low-cost airline. And it seems to me that they're confused. Mm-hmm. Yes, Peter, you want to talk about Singapore Airlines, your home carrier.
Thank you, Regis. Not particularly about Singapore Airlines, but I think if I can make an observation and then ask a question to a slight wrinkle on what you were just talking about, subsidiaries. First of all, obviously not every carrier is as smart as the others. And I think what we've seen in Asia is that most of the established full-service carriers have been pretty dumb when it came to recognising the value of a subsidiary. Qantas, I think, has a model to die for in terms of its subsidiary. It's not just a defensive model, it's a model that has actually been developed initially as a defensive model to cut out Virgin Blue and to protect it in the domestic market, but extrapolating on that in a very aggressive way to take advantage of the opportunities in a fast-growing international market in Asia. And that has become very, very effective for it. It's actually writing the script, I think, for one of the airline types of the future. That subsidiary works very, very effectively. Singapore, yeah, they came into it half-baked with a half-armed tiger, which bit them, and they're still stuffing it up in a big way. Thai is the same. They haven't got it right. The Japanese carriers really don't understand it, and they don't understand either, having seen Jetstar's announcement of its domestic fares yesterday, the day before, just how much it's going to hurt them in the domestic market in a country where costs are so high and fares are so high. It's going to really undermine those carriers seriously, but that's perhaps the way of the future. So I think, yeah, there are lots of different models that have developed in Asia. Some of them have been done intelligently, others haven't been. But if it's done intelligently, I think it's a very, very positive market. My question then is not just, it's a little wrinkle on why don't you have, or will you not have subsidiaries of full service carriers in Europe and America. There's one European carrier, Norwegian, which has talked about emulating the cross-border joint venture of the AirAsia, for example, in Asia, almost purely, to tap into that local market, that fast-growing Asian market. And it's going to grow at double-digit levels for quite some time yet. It seems like a good idea for Norwegian, which has a low-cost culture, but why doesn't an American or a European carrier do it purely to get access to that market, which is what Jetstar's doing? A lot of these routes don't necessarily connect with Australia. They're being opportunistic and taking advantage of your informal liberalisation to create a new entity in a market that's growing. Isn't that a possibility?
Dietmar, would you like?
Well, I have a very specific experience about that. When I was GM in Condor, we operated a 767 with Lufthansa markings on behalf of Lufthansa to Australia, because we managed to have lower seat mile cost on the 67 than Lufthansa had on the 47 due to their complexity, with a lot of focus on premium class, which were not required in the German-Australian market. So there is certainly a way of cooperating, even with a low-cost subsidiary, which we were at that time. However, very soon you end up that in some markets you have an internal competition. And it's pretty hard to decide, does really the passenger have the final decision on who is going to fly, and then you start eating in each other market. And it's pretty hard in a system where the legacy carrier is dominating with his DNA, what the answer in these conflicts is going to be. So I'm wondering how Qantas get their act organized in the future with their subsidiary Jetstar.
My question was a little bit different from that. You picked up most of it, I think, but was in Asia you have a market which is growing enormously fast. It's going to grow fast. You have an opportunity because of this informal liberalisation to gain access purely to the Asian market by establishing a cross-border joint venture. It doesn't have to link with it, even with Europe. Is that not a great opportunity that's being overlooked by the Europeans and the Americans?
Lufthansa will do something pretty soon together with ANA on the German-Japanese route, where they tried to do what KLM and Northwest did many years ago in their respective geography.
David, last response,
Sure.
then we're going to close down.
Just from, I think, a North American perspective, Peter, I mean, it makes all the sense in the world. And then I think we heard Jeff earlier say that post-deregulation in '78, from a labor perspective, just how difficult it has been within those models. And that's why I don't think that, even though it makes sense to set it up and the company would be stronger, which drives more left seats for those pilots and what have you, I just don't see it happening. I think if it does happen, it's going to be more like the Via Australia model. It's somebody like us who started from scratch, who has the opportunity to do that because we've got the cultural ability to do it as opposed to the human factors built in from decades past.
Thank you. I'm going to draw the discussion to a close. We've got a short film to follow. We posed a number of questions. We tried to answer most of them, and on some of them we agreed, on some of them we disagreed. But I think it's been a great opportunity to have 3 airline CEOs and 1 former CEO on the panel, and I'm sure you'll join me in thanking them for their very frank and open answers.
Great.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. Absolute pleasure.
Thank you. David. Thank you.